Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice that many of you are still braving the early starting hour. It also occurred to me that some of the remote students are in very different time zones. What time is it where you guys are? I'm just curious. I noticed that there's some people from very far away.
11:30 in India.
2 p.m.
India, so that's 4.5 hours. 2 p.m. Okay.
Indonesia.
Morning.
Morning. How, Daniela? What time is it where you are?
2 a.m.
You're up at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
1 a.m. right here.
Oh my goodness, in Mexico. Wow, you guys are something else. That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining. That's incredible.
7 a.m. Nigeria.
Okay, that's a little more, that's still pretty early though.
In Brazil
great.
is 3 a.m.
Oh my goodness, you guys are hardcore. Thank you for joining. I feel so soft now, 8 a.m. All right, we'll talk about credit markets and microfinance today. I'm going to mute you guys, but feel free to unmute yourself when you want to ask something. So let me give a little bit of context for this lecture. So last time we talked about returns to capital in micro enterprises in Sri Lanka with Suresh's paper, and we saw that those returns are pretty high, like 60% a year or something. That's really impressive. And that raises the question, maybe we can just give credit to people to lift them out of poverty, or so that they can lift themselves out of poverty. If the returns are really this high, people should just be able to borrow and be less poor. And so what we'll do today is we'll ask, what are the things that can get in the way of such credit markets existing? So in particular, we'll see how credit markets can fail when there's asymmetric information. And so by the end of today, you should understand adverse selection and moral hazard. Raise your hand if you've heard those terms before. All right, good. So for some of you, this will be a repeat. For others, it'll be new. And it'll be a fairly heavy going and technical lecture. I think it's the hardest lecture conceptually of the class. So bear with me for the first hour and try to focus. And then the second hour will be more fun. So towards the end of that, we'll talk about how microfinance tries to overcome these problems of adverse selection and moral hazard. And then we'll look at whether it's delivered on that promise. So what are the impacts of microfinance? Has it really led to significant poverty alleviation? And we'll see that there are some beneficial effects, but it's not a silver bullet to lift people out of poverty. And in particular, we'll see that incomes actually don't go up all that much. So one reason for that might be, we'll see towards the end, that not everybody's a natural entrepreneur. And that was a theme of the reading that you did in the Poor Economics book. Some people may just not have the interest or the skills to run a business. They'd prefer a government job, for example. And on this precise topic, note that the paper that you read by Demel, they focus on enterprises that already exist, right? So these are people who already have experience running a business, and for them it goes well. But when you try to coax others who maybe don't have that interest or skill into it, it may not work out so well. And in line with this view, we'll see in the evidence on microfinance that incomes go up for some people, in particular the ones who already have a little bit of experience. Okay, so let's get into adverse selection and moral hazard. We'll set up a simple model of credit markets, first with perfect markets, and then we'll add these wrinkles and see how the markets fail. So let's think about a borrower who's risk neutral, and they have a project that requires 1 unit of capital, and it pays a return capital RI with a probability PI, and otherwise it pays 0. So what that means is the return to capital here are capital RI times PI. And remember, that's what we said was pretty high in many low-income contexts, what we saw in the last lecture. Then there's a lender, and they can lend to the borrower. They're also risk neutral, and they have an opportunity cost of capital gamma. And you can think of that as what it costs the lender to borrow in capital markets. So this rate is typically thought to be pretty low. When banks borrow from each other, they don't charge each other a lot because they're big institutions that are trustworthy. So what's socially optimal in this setting? It's that all projects should be implemented that have an expected return that's higher than the opportunity cost of borrowing. Yeah, if the return from the project times the probability that it succeeds exceeds the opportunity cost of borrowing, your cost of capital, that's when the project should go ahead, because then there'll be a social benefit. So when does the credit market achieve this, and when does it fail to do that? That's the question for this lecture. Let's start by thinking about a perfect market. And what I mean by that is that there's full information and there's competition amongst the lenders, which means that the lenders make no profit. And we'll also start by assuming full liability. And what that means is that the borrower is on the hook for repaying the loan, regardless of whether their project fails or succeeds. Right? So you take this loan, and even if your business fails, you still have to repay the loan. At what rate does the lender lend in this case? From the lender's perspective, their expected return has to be at least the opportunity cost of capital. And because there's perfect competition, it's exactly the opportunity cost of capital. So in math, that's just setting the interest rate that the lender charges are to their own opportunity cost of capital. That's a zero profit condition. Under this condition, which projects get realized? It's precisely the projects where the borrower's expected returns exceed the interest rate that's charged by the lender. Right? So PI times capital RI, that's what the borrower makes on their project in expectation. And if that's greater than R, the interest rate that they get charged, that's when they'll take the loan. And because R is equal to gamma, it's when PI times capital RI is greater or equal to gamma. That's the projects that go ahead. And remember that we said on the last slide, the socially optimal outcome is exactly this. Projects that have expected returns greater than the opportunity cost of capital are implemented. You'll see this equation show up a bunch of more times. PI times capital RI is greater or equal to gamma. That's the socially optimal outcome. And in a perfect market, that obtains. Okay, so now let's ask what happens under slightly more realistic conditions than these perfect conditions that we've just assumed. Let's start by thinking about limited liability. What does limited liability mean? It says that it's not realistic to assume that this borrower repays regardless of whether their project succeeds or not. No, in reality, what's going to happen is they take the loan, and if they're successful, they'll repay, and if they're not successful, they may not repay. Right? So let's assume that that's true, and we'll see that that actually doesn't lead to a credit market failure as long as there's full information. And the reason for that is the following. So now the lender gets his interest back, the interest rate that he charges R, only if the project is successful, and the probability for that is PI. Otherwise, the lender gets paid zero. So now their expected return instead of R is just R times this probability that's smaller than 1 PI. Yeah. But because there's full information, the lender knows what this probability is and for whom it is how high. And so they can discriminate between the borrowers. They can offer a corresponding individualized RI, so an interest rate that's tailored to the individual borrower in order to make sure that they don't lose money. So at what rate does the lender lend to the borrowers? They now set their expected return in terms of interest, PI times RI, equal to their opportunity cost of capital. So the rate that they set for each individual borrower is RI equals gamma over PI. So now it's no longer just the opportunity cost of capital, but it's a little higher. We divide it by something smaller than 1. They charge a rate that's slightly higher, and it's higher by precisely how much the probability of success determines. From the borrower's perspective, which projects now get realized? So the borrower earns capital RI on their project, and they pay this interest rate R if the project succeeds. And remember, the probability for that is PI. And otherwise, they earn 0 and they pay 0. That's the limited liability setup. So that means the borrower takes the loan if what they get, so the RI minus PI, that's how much they earn when the project succeeds, that's their profit, times the probability that the project does succeed. When that's greater than 0, that's when the borrower wants to take the loan. Right? This is what they get, this is what they pay, and if the probability that that happens times that amount is greater than 0, that's when they take the loan. And so we can substitute in this RI that the borrower faces from the lender from up here, gamma over PI. So we just replace the RI here with that expression. And so that gives us this condition. The project gets realized when PI times capital RI is greater or equal to gamma. And this should look familiar by now, right? We just saw that on the last couple of slides. That's the socially optimal outcome where all the projects that have returns, expected returns higher than the opportunity cost of capital get realized. So what does that mean? It means that even if we have limited liability and the borrowers actually walk away when their projects fail, we don't have a credit market failure quite yet, because there's full information and the lenders can discriminate between the different borrowers. Does that make sense? Any questions about that so far? Great. Okay, you guys are so good. Okay, so this is the socially optimal outcome. Now, let's break this. Adverse selection is one of the ways in which markets can fail. And adverse selection happens when the lender can't perfectly observe how much risk the borrower takes. And we'll see that, yes, that does lead to credit market failures. And here's why. Let's assume that there are now two types of borrowers. There's a risky type and there's a safe type. And the risky type has a higher return, capital RR. This is where the slide where I put my tongue into a knot. Capital RR is the return of the risky type, and that's a bit higher than the return of the safe type, capital RS. But the project of the risky type succeeds with a lower probability, PR. That's lower than the probability of success for the safe type, PS. In addition, let's assume that both of those projects are socially beneficial. So we would like them to go ahead. If everything goes well, the projects happen. So capital RR is greater than the opportunity cost of capital, and capital RS is as well. Sorry, this should be multiplied with the probabilities. How does this look like from the lender's perspective? The lender would like to discriminate between the borrowers, right? The lender would like to charge the safe borrower the interest rate that their probability of success and their returns dictates, and the risky borrower their interest rate. But the lender doesn't know who's who. The lender can't distinguish between the two types. It just knows how many safe borrowers and risky borrowers there are in the population. Things get even worse if they don't know that. But let's say for the moment they know the share of safe borrowers, S. And so what the lender will do is they'll have to charge all borrowers the same interest rate because they can't discriminate them. They don't know who's who. And that interest rate will lie somewhere between the interest rate for the safe and the risky borrower that they would set if they had perfect information. Yeah, so this will be a convex combination of the interest rate that they would set for the safe borrower and the interest rate that they would say for the risky borrower. So they set the expected returns equal to the opportunity cost. The expected returns are the share of safe types times the returns from the safe types using this new interest rate R bar that they set for everybody, plus the share of risky types times the expected returns from the risky types, PS times PR times this new interest rate R bar. Yeah, so you can solve that for R bar and you get this expression that also looks a little bit familiar. It's gamma divided by some function of the probability of success, but now the probability of success is this convex combination of the probability of success for the risky and the safe type. So what does that mean? We know that the probability of success of the risky type is lower, and that means their interest rate should be higher. And so R bar, this new interest rate, will lie in between the two optimal interest rates. It'll be above the interest rate for the safe borrower and below the interest rate for the risky borrower under full information. And so this is where stuff starts to fall apart. Now, there could be safe borrowers who would take the loan under full information if they were to face their RS interest rate, the interest rate that they deserve because they're such good people. But they're not getting charged that interest rate. They're getting charged a higher interest rate, R bar. And so now they don't want to be in that market anymore. It's not worth it for them. Their returns aren't high enough. Yeah, and so now they exit the market and only the risky borrower stays. So only the risky projects get realized. But remember, we said that both projects should be realized. These are both projects that have expected returns greater than gamma. Yeah, so now we've pushed people out of the market who really should be in the market. These are projects that are worthwhile. They should happen, but they're not happening now because of adverse selection. And so that's where adverse selection generates a credit market failure. So what is going to happen now is we'll end up with high interest rates because the lender realizes that all these safe people have exited the market. I'm suddenly facing riskier borrowers here. So I need to raise my interest rates. What happens now? The relatively safe types from the previously risky people exit now, and it continues to unravel. And so in the end, you have high interest rates and high rates of default. And so that's a bad equilibrium that you end up in. So that's how adverse selection can break a credit market. Any questions? Okay, let's talk about moral hazard. There's two kinds of moral hazard that I want to introduce. The first is ex ante moral hazard, and we'll see that that also can generate a credit market failure. So now think about the situation where the borrower can choose between a risky and a safe project. So the borrowers are all the same, but they have a choice of projects. Forget about the risky and safe types. It's the projects now who are risky and safe. And the bank doesn't have influence over which project the borrower chooses. Also assume for the moment that the safe project is better than expectation. So we have the returns from the safe project PS times capital RS exceed the returns from the risky project. What does it mean from the perspective of the borrower? They know this, and so they want to invest in the safe project. And the bank also knows this, and so they offer an interest rate R. That's the interest rate that should apply for the safe project, gamma over the probability of success of the safe project. This is still the limited liability case. Everything here is limited liability. Okay, so that's all fine and good, and things look rosy, but now we'll see that the borrower has an incentive to switch to the risky project. And here's why this happens. So let's think about a borrower for whom it just made sense to borrow for the safe project. They're just on the margin of wanting to borrow. So their earnings are zero. They're just willing to borrow. What are their earnings? Their earnings are the probability of success times the returns they make minus the interest rate they get charged, right? This is the interest rate they get charged by the bank. It's the safe interest rate. And they're doing the safe project. And we've said that they're just in the market, and so their earnings are zero. And so we can solve this for PS. PS is gamma over RS. So now think about what would happen if they switched instead to the risky project. They would earn PR, probability of the risky project succeeding, times capital RR, the returns from the risky project. But how much do they pay for that in terms of interest? They're still only paying that safe interest rate, right? Because the bank can't influence if they're choosing the risky project. The bank is still offering them the safe interest rate. And so now replace this PS down here with the PS that we solved for up here. So the gammas are going to cancel, and you end up with this expression, PR times capital RR minus capital RS. Remember, the risky project has higher returns. So this expression here is going to be greater than zero. The P is greater than zero. And so now the returns for this borrower are greater than zero. So this is a borrower who earns zero when they invest in the safe project. That means they're just willing to borrow. If they now switch to the risky project, their earnings become positive. And so what are they going to do? They're going to switch to the risky project. What does it mean from the perspective of the bank? the bank is losing money, right? The bank set the interest rate for the safe project. They didn't set the interest rate for the risky project. And so the bank is now losing money. And the risky project is worse in expectation than the safe project, right? We said up here that the returns from the safe project are higher. So now the borrower has switched to the risky project, but they really should be doing the safe project from the social perspective. And so that's how ex-ante moral hazard leads to credit market failure. The projects that should be implemented are no longer getting implemented. The borrowers are switching to the risky projects. Any questions about that? Okay, great. Okay, final way in which credit markets can fall apart, ex post moral hazard. This is the situation where even when the project is successful, the borrowers have already taken the loan from the bank, they've done the project, they've gotten everything they want. Why should they?
So I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry, for the moral hazard, the ex-ante moral hazard, what lay up investors to go and invest in risky projects instead of investing in safe projects that have a higher expectation, higher return on expectation?
Why would they do that?
Yeah.
Your question? Yeah, so that's because of these two lines here. So if you think about someone who is just willing to invest in the safe project, their earnings are zero on the safe project. I've shown in this line that if they switch to the risky project, their earnings are higher. Yeah, okay. So it's this expression here.
Okay.
And that's because, and the reason, sorry, maybe let me supplement it with the intuition. The intuition is that because the bank can't influence which project they choose, and the bank starts by offering the interest rate for the safe project, the borrower has an advantage to switching to the risky project because they're getting those higher returns, but they're still getting charged the cheap interest rate for the safe project. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
because of the higher return that. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are we supposed to be able to explain this in both mathematical and words?
Yes. And if there
yes, I have one question.
Sorry, give me a second.
Return on risky project minus return to safe project is negative.
Hang on.
Probability of risky project.
Hang on, give me 1 second. I want to answer this question in the room about the exam. So yes, I would like you to be on top of that, and I'll specify a little more clearly before the exam precisely what I want you to know and what you can forget about. Yeah. So, and sorry, to your question, sorry, I didn't see who asked that question, but the rate.
I have asked the question.
Raushan, yes, the rate of return of the risky project is still higher.
On risky project minus return to safe project is negative.
No, the rate of return to the risky project is still higher than that of the safe project.
I'm saying this part R return on R minus return on S is negative because return on R.
No, sorry, I should have said that the rate of return to the risky project is higher than that of the safe project. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Great. So ex post moral hazard. So the borrower has gotten their loan, they've implemented their project. Why should they repay the bank? Normally, if contracts are perfectly enforceable, you can't avoid it, but these are often settings where they aren't, right? So the bank has to enforce this loan. That's really costly and time consuming for the bank. In many cases, the loans are small enough that it's not worth it from a financial perspective for the bank to go after borrowers with such small loans. If they do, maybe they only get partial payment. And so what that means is that the bank has to charge a higher interest rate upfront to everybody because they can already foresee that some folks aren't going to want to pay afterwards. yeah, when it's not perfectly enforceable, they need to compensate for those anticipated losses ahead of time. And so again, that means that there are projects that don't get realized that otherwise would have, because everybody's now getting charged a somewhat higher interest rate that doesn't actually correspond to the probability, their expected returns, their probability and their rate of return. So again, good borrowers are being forced out of the market, or if they want to stay in the market, they have to become bad because they can't afford to repay the interest given the returns that they have, the higher interest that they're now being charged. So they have to default as well. Okay, so that's how exposed moral hazard also leads to a credit market failure. Yeah.
How is that different from the first selection? That's sort of the same because now again the
yes. So yes, so it's very similar, except here it happens after the fact, right? So it could be that ex ante these types are exactly the same. They just think about, you know, after they've taken their loan, they think that life might be nicer if they just defaulted. So it's a related concept, and the mechanism is very similar. Yeah.
Does the bank lose if they charge the normal interest rate and then the guy who borrowed switches to the risky project? Does the bank lose then, or is it just that they are not able to get all the money they would have gotten if they already knew that the borrower would take the risky project?
You're talking about the ex ante moral hazard, this setup? And the question is, does the bank lose under what condition when they switch to the risky project? Yeah, exactly, because they're charging them the low interest rate, right? They're charging them the interest rate for the safe project. But if they're doing the risky project, they should really be charged a higher interest rate to reflect that increased risk that they're taking. But the bank didn't do that, and so now they're losing money.
Okay, but are they losing, like, is it really negative, or are they just not getting what they could have gotten?
So in this stylized model, it's negative. Okay. So we're still in a competitive market, and so the bank is not making a profit, and so it's negative. Yeah. Great questions. Okay, any other questions about this? Okay, so this is most of the hard stuff. There's one more slightly hard thing that I want to talk about, and then you can breathe. So how important are these asymmetries in the world? They exist in theory. We've seen that they can break credit markets, but do they really exist in the world? And so this is where I want to introduce one of my favorite papers in economics by Dean Carlin and John Zinman. It's a super clever study that came out in 2009. It's called Observing Unobservables, and I've put it in the folder on the website that's called Non-Required Papers. Okay, so they want to observe these hidden information asymmetries that lead to adverse selection and moral hazard. And they do that with a very, very clever design in a lending setting in South Africa. So this is a big lender that sends a letter to potential borrowers to invite them to take a loan. And that letter has an interest rate in it. So they say, would you be interested in a new loan? The interest rate is going to be something like 3% or so. And then people sign up for this loan, and they sign the contract, or they express their willingness to take this loan, and that becomes the sample. So it's the people who have selected into the loan under those initial conditions, under what's going to be called the high offer rate. So this 3% or so, that's the high rate. After people have selected into this loan, they get surprised in various ways. So there's 5 groups here that get different kinds of surprises. One group, group 3, let's start with group 3, gets an interest rate surprise. So they get told, you know, you signed up for the 3%. Actually, we're going to do you a favor. We're going to give you a lower interest rate just to make your life a little easier. This was formulated as just something that the computer gave the loan officer. So people get a better interest rate than they signed up for. The other surprise is that some people get a dynamic incentive. They get told, look, you signed up for this loan without any additional promises, but we're actually going to promise you, if you behave well on this loan, we're going to make you another loan next year. That's what's called a dynamic incentive. And so you have these three groups up here. People with get the high offer rate, and then some of them actually, that offer rate actually gets implemented. So that's the control group. But then others get the surprise. Group 3 gets the low contract rate. So that's the nice interest rate and no dynamic incentive. So they don't get told anything about future loans. Group 2 gets the low contract rate and they get this dynamic incentive. So they get told you have a better rate. And also if you behave well, we're going to make you another loan in the future. And then there's a group down here that gets a low offer rate and they either get the dynamic incentive or they don't. Yeah, so their initial offer rate is lower than 3% and they opt in based on that. And then some of them get the dynamic incentive and others don't. Okay, so here's why this is super clever. This design allows them to identify moral hazard and adverse selection. So moral hazard, they're calling hidden action effect. So actions that the bank doesn't know about beforehand that borrowers can undertake, like not repay. If they compare the people with and without incentives to remain in good standing, these dynamic incentives, that identifies moral hazard. Why? Because if there wasn't any moral hazard, then these people would behave exactly the same. You don't need a reason to behave perfectly. You're already doing it anyway. It's only when there is moral hazard and you don't really behave very well without this incentive that there's a difference between these two conditions, right? It takes the extra incentive for you to be a good borrower. So the difference between these two groups, this is what's called hidden action effect 2 here. The people with and without the dynamic incentive to repay, the difference between the default rates of these two groups identifies moral hazard. Does that make sense? Similarly, adverse selection, they're calling the hidden information effect. This is almost a bit easier to see. So if you compare people who with the high versus the low offer rate, but who are getting the same low contract rate, that identifies adverse selection. So the important thing here is that these people selected into the contracts under different conditions. Some people expected to get a high interest rate, other people expected to get a low interest rate. So the composition of the pools should be different. Remember, we said that when the interest rate, when it's only risk, the interest rate goes up when there's only risky folks in the pool. Conversely, when there's a high interest rate, it's the risky folks who should select into that high interest rate. So the high offer rate should be a pool that's composed more of risky people than the low offer rate. So these are the folks who've selected into the loans, but then everybody's getting offered the same low contract rate. So they're paying the same. They're not different on that dimension. They're just different in terms of how they selected into the loan. And so if there is adverse selection, we should see a difference in default rates between these two groups of borrowers. The group with a high offer rate, that should be the risky types. And the group with a low offer rate, that should be the safe types. And so by comparing the default rates in these two groups, we can now identify adverse selection. Super cool research design. One of the nicest I know. And so what happens when they actually look at the results here, they find that adverse selection is not very important. So this difference that I just explained last, that there isn't a big difference in the default rates of these two groups. But moral hazard is quite important. So these dynamic incentives make a difference. When you promise people they're going to get a better loan, they're going to get another loan next year, they behave better. So in their estimate, that means about 13 to 21% of defaults in settings like this one are due to moral hazard. Any questions about this? Yeah.
You're saying they're more risky if it's at a higher offer. Couldn't they just have like a better business plan?
So yes, that could be another reason. But if there's any adverse selection in the market, then you would expect that to show up in addition to any differences like that, right? So Yeah, that's a good point, but it would sit on top of that. Yeah. Okay. All right, so that's all the hard stuff. Now we can relax a little bit and think about how microcredit tries to overcome these problems. So we've seen that in markets like this was a lending model that didn't have the features of microcredit. Now let's think about how microcredit tries to solve adverse selection and moral hazard. So many of you will have heard about microcredit before. It was first popularized by the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. That was founded by Muhammad Yunus, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for it, I think in 2006. And the core features of microcredit are that there's little or no collateral required. That's important in these settings because people don't have a lot of collateral. But in order to solve these problems, and we'll see on the next slide exactly how that happens, the loans are made to groups of borrowers and there's joint liability. So they cover for each other. When someone in the group defaults, the others have to jump in and help out. Often these are targeted to women who are thought to be better at repaying. And they often have dynamic incentive schemes of the kind that I just described. So you can only get a future loan if you pay off the current one. And they go through these stages where you can get ever larger loans if you repay your current loan. And so these are kind of graduation models where you graduate to larger loans over time. Okay, so now let's think about how these features overcome these adverse selection and moral hazard problems that we just talked about. So for adverse selection, there's an explanation by Matrishka Tak from the LSE. He says that safe borrowers are going to want to team up with other safe borrowers because they have a little bit of information about who's safe and who isn't. And so they want to be in the company of other people who are like them, because if they're pairing up with more risky people, they end up being the ones who have to bail them out. In contrast, the risky borrowers are going to end up with the other risky borrowers because none of the safe borrowers want to be in a group with them. And what that means is the risky borrowers are often going to have to bail out their group members. And if that happens with sufficient reliability, if these groups function well enough in terms of social pressure to make that happen, then the bank can keep the interest rate low enough to keep even the safe borrowers in the market. Or at least that's the hope, that if the group enforcement mechanism among the risky folks works well enough, the safe borrowers aren't forced out of the market. So that's how it solves adverse selection, or tries at least. How does it solve ex-ante moral hazard? Remember, that's the choice of risky projects by the borrowers. Again, it's because the group might have more information than the bank. So the group might know if my project is risky, and then they don't want me to do it because they don't want to be on the hook for my failure. Yeah, and so they keep me from pursuing my project because they may have to bail me out if I fail. And so that keeps me from switching to the risky project. I stay in the safe project where I should be. So that's ex-ante moral hazard. And then ex-post moral hazard is very similar. If you take your loan and your project is successful and you say, no, I'm not going to repay, your group is going to be annoyed. That they put pressure on you because, again, they're on the hook for your failure to repay. And so the social relations are important. And in addition, their future loans are on the line, right? They don't want to be listed by the bank as having been in a bad group and not get a future loan as a result of that. And so they make you repay. So that's the sense in which microfinance, this group liability feature in particular, tries to solve these moral hazard and adverse selection problems. Okay, so let's talk about the empirical evidence. You read this one really lovely paper by Britta Augsburg. I'm not going to talk about that. We'll hear about that in the second part of the lecture. But I'll put it into context a little bit. So this paper was published as one of 6 randomized evaluations of microfinance programs in the special issue of the AHA Applied in 2015 that I mentioned last time. And here's an overview of all of these studies. There's a really nice introductory paper by Abhijit Banerjee, Dean Carlin, and John Zinman at the beginning of the issue that I recommend. And let me summarize a little bit what we learned from these studies as a whole. And a good way to do that is to look at the work of someone called Rachel Meager. She's an economics professor at the London School of Economics, who, by the way, has a really amazing Twitter presence. If you're on Twitter, I recommend her. She's extremely funny and very wise. And she's an econometrician, and she's developed techniques to pool the data from all of these randomized evaluations of microcredit. And the reason to do that is because each of the individual projects is not super large. They're perfectly decent evaluations, but the samples often don't permit very precise statements. And so when you pool all the data together, for which Rachel has developed methodologies, you can make more reliable statements. So here's the abstract of what was Rachel's job market paper. And I want to highlight two sentences. The first is this one here. I find the impact on household business and consumption variables is unlikely to be transformative and maybe negligible. So that's the takeaway from the 6 studies taken together. And down here, households with previous business experience have larger but more heterogeneous effects. So that's precisely what we said at the beginning, right? There aren't transformative effects here, but it's the households that already have some sense of how to run a business that do a little bit better on microfinance. And that's the link to the chapter that you read, the Reluctant Entrepreneurs chapter in Esther's and Abhijit's book. Not everybody wants to or can be an entrepreneur, right? Many people, the chapter mentions how many people want a government job or want their kids to have government jobs. And so I think that's where we currently stand with microcredit. It's useful for some people. Many people use it to finance consumption. It's also useful for that, but it's not the silver bullet perhaps that we once hoped it would be. It's unlikely that it's going to solve poverty once and for all. Okay, so in the second half of the talk, we'll again have a surprise guest to tell us about the paper that you read. Are there any questions about what I've said so far? Great. So then let's come back on the hour. This was exhausting, so we get a longer break, and see you then. All right, so let's get started again. So as another nice surprise, I'm very excited to say that we have Britta Augsburg with us, who is the first author of the paper that you read. And Britta is an economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London. That's a research and policy institute that does really cool economic research. It's one of the powerhouses of economic research outside of academia. And she's been involved in a lot of work on microcredit, and including one of these landmark studies that we talked about and that you read. And so, Britta, we're very grateful that you're willing to talk to us today. And I've asked Britta to tell you a little bit about her study initially and what else she's working on, where she's gone since then, but also to say a few words about the IFS as a place to work. So it's a very interesting place that does a lot of work on development. And so I thought it would be interesting for you to get to know that kind of setting where you can do development research without being directly in academia, although still tied to academia. So Britta, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us, and thank you for all of you for reading the paper. So I don't know how you handle this normally. I am very happy to be interrupted with questions. You just have to jump in because I won't be able to pay attention well, maybe I will, but feel free to interrupt and ask questions if you generally like to do that. So yeah, thanks for having me. As Johannes said, I'm Britta Augsburg. I work at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Very briefly, a bit of background about myself, and then as announced already, I thought I'd talk a little bit about my research journey with respect to microfinance. So I'm a development economist at the IFS and doing field experiments. So my current research focus very broadly is on understanding channels through which poverty affects child development, and how policies and programs can be used to kind of target these channels and improve outcomes. My PhD, on the other hand, focused completely on microfinance. There was no focus on children, and I'll talk a little bit how I moved towards that area. I'm at the IFS since 2008, quite some time now. And in general, so as Johannes said, I'll talk more about the IFS at the end. I have a couple of slides, but generally to say we take a microeconomic perspective. We don't do any macroeconomic work. We try to do work that is policy relevant, contributes to the academic literature, and is feasible to answer in a rigorous manner. So depending on whom you talk to in the IFS, some might focus more or completely on one or two of the areas. So some are working only on policy, some only in like very academic, but most people combine the work. And we have a group that works on development, and we try to usually, if possible, combine all of these three aims. Our starting point are typically field experiments or randomized controlled trials. So we raise funds to get that money to implement that. We design questionnaires, we design the service, we work with the implementing institutions, and then sit down and do the academic work. We usually, after kind of the main impact analysis, try to augment these randomized controlled trials with economic and structural models. We use innovative data collection where we can, and try to also merge data that we collect with secondary data, such as administrative data. But going back to my PhD, my thesis was microfinance, greater good or lesser evil. I handed in 2008, started in 2005. So that was still kind of a period where microfinance was really hailed as the solution, and the Nobel Prize just had given out to Mohammed Yunus, and there was a lot going on. And so in my thesis, I talk a little bit, the evil kind of I touch upon is, on the one hand, how it was talked about that microfinance was kind of almost replacing a lot of other social programs. So it was really big, and even some governments would say we're relying on microfinance doing things rather than, thinking of labor programs that provide jobs, etc. It was also talked about in the kind of supply side, the microfinance institutions, that there was a mission drift observed. So going away from the social goals of lifting the poor out of poverty towards business values. So quite a few institutions were actually going public at that point. Of course, then focusing on profit also for the investors. And a bit related to that, kind of thinking more in the field, there was quite a bit of talk about unethical practices that were being implemented to really ensure that repayment rates are high, etc. On the other hand, the good that I talk about in my thesis is, so I focused a lot on one intervention by a microfinance institution in India that provides business loans like a typical MFI, but also loans for investment in cows and buffaloes as an income diversification strategy. So I collected data in a district of the state of Andhra Pradesh in Anantapur in India, which is one of the most drought-prone areas in the country. And despite that, people are relying mainly on agriculture as their main income. And so having milk to sell as an extra income generating activity was seen as income diversification, and not through an RCT. That was early stages. I was collecting data and did propensity score matching, but I could find support for that idea. I moved then to the IFS actually in 2008, and the two projects I initially focused on primarily, in addition to some more work on the PhD, were two RCT impact evaluations, that one of which I just heard you were reading also. That was the first, or probably the one in Bosnia, and the other one in Mongolia. So in case someone missed reading it very briefly, so Bosnia is and was at that point already like a microfinance market that's pretty saturated, a lot of MFIs working there. So they were thinking about how to expand their client base. And so we collaborated with an institution, and in fact, in both of these projects also with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And we're thinking of whether clients that were normally rejected could actually be given credit and see whether they are worthwhile clients, both on the side of repaying the loans, but also importantly on whether this is beneficial for the clients. In Mongolia, we did a randomized controlled trial where we looked at joint versus individual liability, and we're interested whether that makes a difference in outcomes to the clients. And so both of these studies, as you probably know, were published in the special issue, which was used really, or kind of shook off the sector quite a bit, saying that actually microfinance doesn't work. And those that were already a bit negative about it, and I mentioned some of the reasons earlier, we're kind of using this to argue that microfinance is really not the promise, that the silver bullet that it was made up to be, and this is not working, etc. Now, if one reads this more closely, the conclusion is more nuanced, right? I put this here. It's like the conclusion roughly from these RCTs that were pulled together is that microfinance is modestly positive, but has no transformative effects. And that it considers specific outcomes in specific contexts, and also specific products were considered, right? So while several randomized controlled trials were pulled together, which is great to kind of get a bit better idea of generalizability, it was still very specific studies that were done independent from each other. So after these studies, we did more work on the Mongolia data, and did another study where we actually used some of the, what I was mentioning, innovative data that we collected, where we get a measure of riskiness of investments for these clients. So what we collected very briefly is we asked clients, like, before the intervention started, if you invest, if you get this loan and you make the investment, what do you expect the income for you to be, the minimum and the maximum? And then we get some more information to be able to get the distribution of expected income. And we use this to construct a measure of risk, right? You can, for example, imagine if you have a very low minimum, very high maximum, that is a sign for being a more risky project, rather than if you're very clear what you're going to have. And with a theoretical model and kind of testing these predictions based on that data, we kind of show that microfinance, and in particular joint liability, can play a role in kind of an insurance role in terms of risk, like diversifying risk again. So kind of also linking a bit to my work in the PhD. So now, if I think of stages in my work on microfinance, nowadays, I look much less at microfinance as a business investment, but much more as a means to invest in human capital. And so move away from thinking, does microfinance increase profit? Does it increase income from these households? Does it lift them out of poverty? But can we improve the human capital more broadly with the finance? And so 3 questions that I want to discuss in a bit more detail in this talk, that what we're currently working on, trying to get papers out, is first, whether microcredit can be an effective tool and increase human capital investments. And human capital investments could, for example, be education. We look at what loan design feature can drive investment choices, and also whether microcredit could be a means to complement government finances or other financial tools, but we focus on subsidies provided by the government for human capital investments. And the investment that I consider in particular is household sanitation. Sanitation, broadly defined, is kind of facilities that allow for safe disposal of human waste, basically feces and urine, and ultimately what I talk about is toilets. Maybe an aside, when I started at the IFS, people were thinking of me as the Buffalo girl, then I moved to the toilet girl, like that, quite a career path. I don't know what it is today, but so I do a lot of work nowadays thinking about how to get people to invest and use toilets, basically. So very briefly, a little bit why I think that's relevant and why other people think that's relevant, and why I think economists should also focus on it a little bit more. So sanitation, there's kind of wide agreement that it is really important. So in 2013, readers of the British Medical Journal said it's kind of the greatest medical advance since the 1840s. And also, so a lot of my work is in the context of India. Gandhi was saying at that point already that sanitation is more important than independence, so it gives quite a bit of weight. At the same time, it's been also hailed as a very important challenge. So the New York Times, for example, said it was kind of the greatest untold development challenge facing the international community. And of course, now with the COVID pandemic, this has been highlighted even more, the importance of proper sanitation, hand washing, etc. So sanitation is part of water sanitation and hygiene, so that's often taken together. And so hand washing, etc. is part of that. And to give you just a brief idea of this scale, in 2020, about half of the population lacked access to safely managed sanitation. So some might have, so majority, like a lot of people just openly defecate. And some might have some makeshift toilets, but basically only half of the population have properly safe toilets that dispose well of the waste. And so that is kind of not great for the individuals that go out, but there's this externality aspect as well. So if you have a toilet, fine, but if your neighbor is still contaminating the environment, that might affect yours and your family's health as well. So it's a public health problem. And it's been established that it has really severe consequences. So we know it's an important contributor to morbidity, which again is associated with short and long-term effects on human capital. It's not just morbidity, but also mortality. So there's different estimates out there, but including that there might be almost 2,000 children dying a day because of improper sanitation. And there is estimates that kind of take all these different losses into account. So loss of working hours, health expenditures, loss of tourism, etc., and sees how that impacts GDP. And in India, it was estimated, now I don't know which year it was, but I think 2016 or so, that India loses 6.5% of GDP annually because of unsafe sanitation. So it's really quite immense. And so going back to the question, so we think quite a bit on how to improve that situation. And so one question is whether credit can support households that are liquidity constrained to make this investment, because a toilet is quite expensive, can be, depending on the context, can be like 20 to 40% of annual household income in that range. And there is evidence that in general, microcredit can be effective in increasing such lumpy human capital investments. There are studies on bed nets, on water connection and filters, and also a study on toilets. So it's already quite a bit of some work out there looking at this. We contribute to this. We did a study, an RCT in India, again in Maharashtra, where we randomized gram panchayats, for those not aware, there's basically villages, into one of 3 arms. So these were areas where a microfinance institution was working already. So they had their clients and they offered a new loan product specific for sanitation. And so in 40 villages, the clients now were offered this sanitation loan in addition to everything else. In 40 further villages, we also implemented an awareness creation campaign. And then there was the business as usual in a control group. And this was, to existing clients. So it's not that we're now introducing new finance more general, but specific for this human capital investment. Some of the key findings. So first of all, we see that the loan is taken up. About 20% of eligible clients do make use of this new loan product. We see this increase over time. Apologies for this table, but I didn't have time to make it beautiful. So we see that about half of these sanitation loans are actually used to construct new toilets. So this is toilets that would otherwise not have been constructed had the credit not been offered. And importantly, these are functioning toilets and they are used. So we also see that open defecation decreases, which is what we ultimately care, or anyone you ask care about. I'll talk about this in 1 second. In terms of the awareness creation, we hit a wall, a bit of a puzzle. We had the same loan uptake, but we didn't have significant conversion of this loan to new toilets. We're still doing work trying to explain why this might be, because it's really the opposite of what we would have expected. And any thoughts, really, at some point, welcome. So we've done several things that I'm happy to discuss if there's time or interest. So one thing I thought I wanted to highlight here, and that's about links to how we think about RCTs, about microcredit. So in this context, the parameter, when we look at the impact of sanitation loans on toilet uptake, what this gets us is the percentage of new toilets that otherwise would not have been constructed. And as I said, if they're used, that's what, from a public health perspective, that's what we mainly care about. However, what this does not tell us is if there's households, let's say I wanted to build a toilet and I would have used my savings or maybe used a more expensive credit source, money lender or whatever. And now this microfinance loan comes and I don't need to use my savings. I can keep the savings and feel more secure, or I can instead use the savings for education investment or something else. And I just replace the finance basically now with a credit and build a toilet. Now these toilets, they will not appear in the parameter that we estimate the impact of the credit, because in the control group, I would have, had I been in the control group, still constructed the toilet, right? So as a microfinance institution or as an investor, if I want to know whether credit works to make investments into sanitation, that's what I'm more interested in, right? And you can of course ask about that, but that's not so easy to measure, because if you ask someone, you got a credit which you said you would use for sanitation, did you use it for sanitation? Some people might lie, right? So it's a bit tricky sometimes, so worth thinking about what the parameter actually really estimates and gives you. Okay, so the second question was on what loan design features drive investment choices. And what we look at here is the fact that the loans are labeled. If you've looked a bit more at the literature on microfinance, there's quite a bit out there on different types of design features, such as grace periods, installment rates, I think that, yeah, size of installments, etc. What hasn't really been discussed much is the fact that these loans are always labeled. So the typical loan is for business. You're not just giving money and you can do what you want and expect that you invest it into a business and to the best out of it. No, there is some nudging, you can almost say, in putting a label on it. And ideally, to kind of think of the effect of this label and how it defines or influences investment choices of the households, we would have had, like, if you want to design an experiment, you would have had an arm where the clients just are offered a loan that they can use whatever at exactly the same conditions, and one where it is labeled for sanitation. That was infeasible because already the microfinance, so we discussed this with the MFI and they already said, look, we think the label is important. We think we want this to keep that, and we don't think good things will come out if we just give the money. And so we approached this through a theoretical model again and testing predictions. And we do find that the label influences investment choices. And you can think there's different channels that you can think about how this plays a role. But for example, there's literature on mental accounting that it helps people to kind of say, okay, this money is for sanitation. I'm not going to use it for something else. And we do several analyses in the paper. I just wanted to point out one that is kind of one of the evidence that we suggest. So we're showing here a distribution. So I should mention one important point, which I haven't so far. So the sanitation loan, the interest rate is lower than for business loans, right? And that, can be good reasons, because sanitation loans, if you invest, you might get a toilet, then you might be healthier, then you might work more, and then you get more income, and then, that's a good outcome that you might want to achieve. But you don't have directly, as with business, potentially income that you can use to repay the loan, right? And so typically microfinance institution actually provided as a slightly lower interest rate to make it easier to repay these type of loans. At the same time, the loans are not, the loan use is not really monitored, and it's definitely not enforced. As long as the clients repay the loan, there's no reason for the microfinance institution to say when they didn't invest into a toilet, we kick you out, we're not going to give you credit anymore. Because in the end, institutions are reliant on the clients paying back, and that's more important to them than actually constructing a toilet. And who's to say that if they then use the loan instead for sanitation or something else or a business, that's actually, they shouldn't be doing that. So there's different views how this should be handled, but basically institutions do not enforce the loan use. And what that means is that households, they have now access to a cheaper loan, and could, in theory, take this and other loans together and have lower cost borrowing. And this is one of the reason why it's interesting in this context, also to show that still there's these sanitation investments, and we think the label matters. And so this links to the graph. Then we show, given the borrowing that these clients did over the period of the experiment, which is 1.5 years, this is the proportion of credit that they took at the lowest interest rate available from the microfinance institution. We then just very theoretically think, what if they had borrowed the same amount, but used the lowest credit available to them, including the sanitation loan, and this is what the distribution would have looked like, so the white bit. So you see that it's widely different. And this is supporting the idea that households are not necessarily max or minimizing the cost of their borrowing. And then joined with other evidence, we conclude from that the label is quite important. So the third and final question, I'm a bit faster, do interrupt me if you want, is on microcredit complementing government finances. So in India, so what we exploit here is that the randomized control trial was implemented exactly the same time the flagship program of the Indian government started. It's called the Swachh Bharat Mission, which provides subsidy and information provision to households. So the Prime Minister of India, Modi, he took this as his important, one of his key policies. And by 2021, the goal was to make India open defecation free. And we exploit this, and we basically do a heterogeneity analysis and look at whether loan uptake and loan conversion to toilets differs by whether households are eligible for the subsidy. So the subsidy provided by the government is given to vulnerable households. Is a specific definition, but basically you can think of the poorer ones who are liquidity constrained for sanitation. And the key finding again here is that there is this complementarity. It's a good idea. There's good reasons to combine the different financing mechanisms. And there's two ways this is happening. For one, there's those that are subsidy ineligible. And there's quite a few households that are not poor enough to get the subsidy, but that are still liquidity constrained and would not invest into sanitation if the microcredit was not available. The second channel is actually on those that are eligible for the subsidy. And that is because of a specific design feature of the subsidy, which is that the credit is only provided after the toilet is constructed. The idea of that is that there's no misuse of the subsidy and that you actually get toilets with it. But at the same time, if you provide subsidy to households that are liquidity constrained, they might not be able to construct the toilets, even knowing that they will get the subsidy afterwards. So we find that this microcredit for these types of households serves as a type of bridge funding. So they take the credit, then they later get the subsidy for the toilet that they constructed. So this is basically all on the credit. I don't know whether I should stop here a little bit or go directly into also the IFS slides.
It's up to you, Britta. I can imagine that people might have questions now, in which case we could take a few minutes for that.
Sure, I'm happy either way.
Great. So I will put my students on the spot a little bit. Each student came prepared with 2 questions about your study, which they're very eager to ask.
I hope I remember. It's been some time that I read it. I should have reread actually. No, okay, I'm ready. So there's Luisa, I think.
Hi, may I? Hello, good morning.
Morning.
So I have a question. It's kind of more an commentary / question. So thank you for your time here. And so I was thinking about what you discussed in regarding to lump investment. So there is kind of phenomenon here in Brazil because we have a really large credit to smallholder farms provided provided by the government in Brazil. So what I observed from my personal experience is that some smallholder farms actually they use this kind of credit and buy, for example, machinery, but they don't really need machinery to run their business. This is kind of over. I don't know what kind of phenomenon is that, but the credit here in Brazil doesn't enable the smallholder farm to, for example, credit a greenhouse, for example, that would be much more beneficial to this smallholder farm than a machinery, for example. So this is kind of related, and that's the question. This is kind of related to lumpy investment, but also it's not, because you also said about the subsidized nets. So that would be the lump investment for human capital. So I would like to, from your perspective, I would like to know much more about that. Thank you.
So the question is, in how far these are lumpy investments, or why? So one thing about credit for the lumpy investments is that for households, these type of households that are targeted, it's difficult to save, right? And so basically the credit works as a saving device that's kind of turned on its head, if you want to say it like that. Of course, you have to pay a bit more. So they can, rather than saving, and there's literature on saving, that if you have kind of locked boxes or saving means of saving that others are not aware of it, that people can build up the savings. But very often it seems the case that this is not possible for a number of constraints. And so households like to take credit for this because it allows them to pay over time for this lumpy investment. And this is, I think, kind of the idea how credit is used for that. In terms of, I don't know whether that answers your question exactly, probably not exactly, or to part.
No, it's okay. It's just to understand more about the lumpy investment, because in the paper that I read, I felt that it was kind of similar to what I'm seeing here, what I've saw here, and during some visits in smallholder farms. But also when you said about the subsidized nets, I was like, I'm not quite sure if I got that right, that term right, that discussion. So
the subsidy that we're considering is for these toilets. With the bed nets, that's this credit. Well, there's nuances to the study as well. But so the government in this case has an incentive to subsidize because of the externality of the sanitation, and at the same time, it's a big and lumpy investment. It's rare that you do a toilet in installments. I don't know, it's interesting what you say about the case that people invest in machinery although they don't need it. I guess there's a question whether it still makes their business more effective and more profitable, and that might be rational to do.
Maybe let me see if there are any questions in the room, Britta, because you don't see the folks who are sitting here.
Mm-hmm.
Not right now. So maybe we can move on to, I think, Akinwale, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, good morning, Prof. Yeah, I want to ask if during your study, if some people actually got the sanitation loan at low interest rate and used that money for something else, like they took advantage of the low interest rate from sanitation loan and they divert it maybe to their business. And if it happens, how does it affect the outcome of your study?
Yeah, thanks. That's a nice question. So we do quite a bit of work in trying to understand whether the loans were used for investments other than toilets they wouldn't have constructed otherwise. So whether they have a toilet and they improve that, or whether they kind of just repair a toilet, or several things that they could do with the money. And the evidence points towards that the credit is not really used for that type of investment, and if it is, just minimally. And so from the impacts that we get, that 20% take a loan, about 10% construct a toilet, that means that 50% of the loans, and that answers your questions, are not used for sanitation investments. That might be plus minus, we don't know exactly, but it points to quite a large part of the loans not having been used for sanitation. We tried to pin down what they were used for, but it's very difficult. It's likely a combination of many things. So actually some households, we do ask them directly, some households do tell us that they use the loan for consumption purposes. We do look at data that we collected, such as, did you make business investments, what's your business profits, etc. The point estimate suggests some investment in these businesses, but we don't have significance. We can't say that for sure. And our working hypothesis is that it's just a number of investments that are being made that we can't capture well in an indicator to get significance there. Which is also why the setting of our study is quite nice to see whether the label matters in the investment, because a toilet investment is relatively or is easier to pin down and measure than a business investment.
Does it mean that people don't really care about the sanitation around them?
There will be there will definitely be people that don't care,
also.
or that already had a toilet. There were people that had a toilet and took the sanitation loan. And that also points towards this monitoring being quite low touch and not really important. Yeah.
So going forward, it means that there should be more monitoring when somebody's conducting such an experiment.
Actually, we are exactly thinking about that, whether to vary the type of the extent of monitoring and how much. Whether it's good or bad is really difficult to say, right? Because it might be that households had some shock, I don't know, death of an earning member or a wedding or other things, and they just really needed to divert the money. If you force these type of households to still invest into a toilet, that might have some adverse effects that you don't want to have. So I don't really know the answer to your question.
All right, thank you.
I think Adit was next.
Yes, hello. It's kind of linked to the previous question. Microcredit is basically aimed at providing credit at low collateral or no collateral, right? But I was interested to see why was the take-up very low and only 20% took up. So is that because the credit was coupled with building toilets, or is there any other reason?
So from our study, we know that the label did make some people not use the loan. It's hard to pin down exactly how many, but that will definitely play a role. I agree with you that the uptake is actually low. One would expect it to be higher, but so the label does seem to play an important role. There's another channel which we can't pin down, but I think it's interesting, so I'm just going to say it. You have this group liability, and so your group members should be interested in you being able to repay the loan primarily, right? A sanitation loan is a non-income generating loan in the first place. So in a way, the joint liability might actually be counterproductive to taking sanitation loans. We can't pin that down. I don't know to what extent that would be the case, but I think it's an interesting process.
Britta, you should let me know how much time you want to leave for the material on IFS. We can take a few more questions, or you can.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a few more questions. So I have 3 slides on it. Of course, depends how many questions people want to ask about that, but yeah.
Okay, should we take 2 more and then we move on to that?
Okay.
Great. Daniela was next.
Okay, so my question originated from one of the conclusions of your study, the one that we read, that was about how there was some effect on the consumption of alcohol and tobacco, and wonder if giving these microcredits for sanitation investment has affected in any way that type of consumption as well. And my second question is whether this is more of an outside of the box question, I think. What could be some of the cultural implications of having a toilet that, for some people, maybe in my head, when I picture a toilet is a white, like the picture that you showed, but maybe the one that is being implemented is not necessarily the conventional one that we have, at least in the US. And what could be some of the social, the cultural implications of having one at home or sharing one in I don't know if it's in a village or something like that.
The last one I can talk a lot about. Let me go first to the consumption question. We don't see any impacts of the intervention on consumption, which can be for a number of reasons, but importantly, I think because collecting consumption data is quite difficult, and we collected it 1.5 years after the program was implemented. So a lot of people did not have the loan outstanding anymore. So it could have been that people reduced their consumption to repay the loan. We would not have collected data in the period where this happened. So we don't find anything on that. We also don't find increase on consumption though, right? So we don't really know. The alcohol point, I don't have too much to say, except that I think it's an interesting area to do more on. Like I've now seen in several studies that there is this reduction in alcohol consumption when people take microcredit. And at least, I might be wrong, but I haven't seen anything that digs into that a little bit deeper, what might be behind it. Whether it's economic, psychological, or other reasons, I think that would be an interesting topic. On the impacts of having a toilet more general, just a few things that I think are worth mentioning. People typically state that it provides them status in the village. They do realize the health benefits from it, also the externality and other benefits. There might also be negative effects though from constructing a toilet. So you have, especially from qualitative work, you have evidence that it makes women be more at home, like going out for open defecation with a group of women. So usually they go together, it's a safety issue. So having a toilet might improve your safety, but on the other hand, you lose this social aspect of going out in the morning. Some older people say, I don't want to have a toilet, I want to be in a stinker room, I want to go out and get my exercise in the morning, right? So there's like a lot of different types of stories and avenues that you can think about.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Stockholm students, last chance for a question. It's so early in the morning. Okay, then I think Sina was the next question.
Hi, can you hear me well? I think I'm.
Yep.
Hello.
We can hear you fine.
Thank you for your presentation. And just have a quick question. So the system now, it works like this, that we give out, you give out loans to people and encourage them to build like toilets and use them for better sanitation. Wouldn't it be better if like instead of giving out loans, the government could provide some places, or I don't know, some stores that people could go there and buy the service. The service here is like having toilet. Buy it with like I don't know what is the term in English, but pay it like loans. Pay for the service like how they're gonna pay for the loans to the bank. So this way we can make sure that this loan that we are giving out to people is actually being used to, I don't know, build toilets in this case. So it's not just banks giving out loans. So a lot of people may use the loan with the low interest for maybe business purposes.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. So what I can say about that is two things, I guess. So coordinating and providing the toilets or the service to construct the toilet, etc., is of course more expensive than not doing so. It might be beneficial if households don't have the information and don't want to collect the information themselves, how to do it. It might be negative in the sense that you might take away choice of what to construct, what type of toilet to construct. There is this other study that I briefly mentioned that also provides microcredit for toilet investments. They don't give the cash to the households. They give construction materials of the toilet for the toilets. So that's a bit what I think you're suggesting. Interestingly, it's a very different context. It's a different product. It's not clients of the institution that have been there for a long time, etc. But the loan to toilet conversion rate in this context is significantly lower than the one in our context. So I think it's an open question, what is really the better approach to follow?
Thank you.
Great. Maybe Britta will let you talk a little bit about the IFS. Manjisha and Ankita, I'm sorry, maybe we can get to your questions at the end if we still have time.
If we don't, I'm happy for you to email me and ask. I have quite a few deadlines in September if I don't respond directly, but otherwise feel free to be patient, but feel free to email me. Okay, so at the IFS, so we're an independent research institute. We're not a think tank, that's so important. But I mentioned already before, we have this dual purpose of advising policy or do policy relevant research and have academic high quality outputs. We are kind of funded by a research institution. We have a large fund, the Economic and Social Research Council, but also charitable foundations, government organizations, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded some projects. So we have some core funding, and then we are kind of expected to bring in funds as well. So we don't teach, but we write proposals to get in money, which is nice because in a way you can basically think, this is the type of research I would like to do. If I get the money, I can do it. And so we respond to calls of funding organizations and suggest research to do. We don't do consultancy because we really want to be an independent institution. We're about 72 employees at the moment, directly employed. A bit more detail here. We have and 21 admin support. So most economists are recruited straight from university. Some might have, often they have only a bachelor, some might have a master. Most, if they don't have a master when they come to the IFS, do the master in parallel with being at the IFS and working. So they reduce their working hour and do the master, typically at UCL. Some also follow on and do a PhD. So we have this, that 75% of the staff that's here at the moment arrived already with a master, and 98% now have one or do one of the academic staff. And 64% are actually doing a PhD. So it's encouraged to continue the education while being at the IFS. We have a roughly even gender split. If I'm not mistaken, we're slightly more women at this point. So that's kind of for an economic institution, I think quite unique. We have about half of the staff, a bit more, is from the UK, and the rest is a mixture from the EU, Asia, Africa. We say that from abroad. These are the kind of areas that we cover, so it's quite broad. We have small group working on sanitation and health. We have relatively large group working on human capital, more general, both in developing countries and in the UK, thinking about skills from early childhood to university. We have stuff on pensions and public finances, so more traditional research at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, industrial organization, tax, income, work, and welfare, so it's quite broad. When someone applies to the IFS, typically it goes first, here. Well, let me say this first. So in these areas, we usually work in small teams, which are structured that you have an associate director, which is kind of my role at the moment, that manages a team of research economists and senior research economists, and then we collaborate a lot with researchers and other institutions. So typically you would enter as a research economist, you would be put on 2 to 3 projects within one of these areas that I mentioned. So while interest of the applicants or the new staff is taken into account, it depends on demand in the sectors where someone starts working. So you might have done a master in development, but you would be then allocated to a different sector. That can happen. So it's expected that people are interested to work at the IFS in general rather than specific area. So then one works on specific projects. Is right away, it's always collaboration, right? So junior staff is presenting, is on any output. There's very little hierarchy in that respect. And then over time, it's expected from a research economist to start and build up a research agenda, moving to becoming a senior research economist, where you kind of have really your area where you're an expert, you have an expertise, and then when you get more funds in project, you can kind of start having your own area and move up to an associate director. So over time, it is expected and you're supported to start working much more independently and managing as well. That's kind of roughly actually the slides that I have on the IFS. So we have, in terms of roles to apply for, there's very rare that someone comes in at a senior research economist level or higher than that. Typically it's as a research economist if one goes for a permanent position. The application deadline is in beginning of November. We also have a role for summer students. So that's 6 weeks over the summer where someone comes in and works on a project that should be relatively self-contained. Could be on the policy side, could be on the more academic side. It kind of varies. Often it's maybe an area, I might have a research question and would like to get an idea whether that's feasible to do, whether there's data, and then do some initial data analysis, or we might have collected data and there's some interesting part we still want to analyze, projects like that. And then we have for later on, we have postdoctoral fellowships as well. And the application process is that, well, you fill in an online application form, and then there's 2 rounds of interviews. The first round, actually in the application form, you're also asked to write a little essay. And then in the 2 rounds of interviews, the first rounds, you're on 2 panels and they ask you questions that you answer. And I think it's worth saying, these are not the typical interview questions that you think about. So we will never ask about strengths and weaknesses, but we ask questions that tell us whether you think like an economist. And the thinking can be wrong, that's okay. But like the ultimate answer, you might not get the right answer, but if you understand substitution and income effects, that's kind of the thing we want to see in these interviews. And in the second round, you then are asked to give a presentation, so that we also get a bit more presentation skills. And yeah, it's not expected that all of this is really well known, but that you're already good at it, but kind of get a bit of a feeling. And yes, all this information is also online. That's how it works. And so this is really a rough overview. I'm very happy to talk about any of these aspects in more detail. Questions? Go back on the microfinance.
Great, thank you, Britta. So I think we have a little more time for questions on both this topic, IFS, as well as on the studies and the talk. Maybe I'll start. Britta, can summer students be bachelor students or students who just finished their bachelor?
Yeah, they can. There's no constraint on that. Often so are you asking whether they need to have it? Because often they don't even have a bachelor.
Okay, great. So
that's rather on the other hand, yeah.
Great.
I think there's one hand up.
Manjisha, yeah. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Manjisha. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, ma'am, my question is, I have done a primary survey in Bihar, India, and as per the Swachh Bharat mission, the subsidy is given after the construction of toilet. But sometimes what I found is, in rural Bihar, they have constructed the toilet, but they didn't get the subsidy. So in that case, what would be the alternative if we can do with what we can do with the microcredit? Something with, is there any possibility that can be done through microcredit or microfinance if the subsidy is not given to them, or if they didn't receive the subsidy in any case?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we see that also that there is uncertainty about whether the subsidy is being given, and we actually see that households that take a loan for sanitation and live in areas where there's a large delay in receiving the subsidies, that they're actually not constructing the toilets, and so ultimately they would also not get the subsidy. And then there's of course those that don't even get the subsidy. So we were collaborating with a team, Pondicherry, and they're in the field to do some more qualitative research to, among other, well, we want to solve that puzzle I mentioned, but also to get a bit at this with a subsidy, because they also, and we're talking next week, but they initially also already said that some households were kind of excited to take the credit, and then they realized that, you know, there won't be the subsidy or it will be delayed, and so then they misuse it. So it's difficult to say, because those that rely on the subsidy, they might not be the right people to actually get credit for it, right? So then it's more about improving the targeting of the subsidy scheme, I would say. The targeting and the implementation, obviously. And another problem with the subsidy is that it's only given if people didn't have a toilet, don't have a toilet, and some people have makeshift bad toilets they may break down. So there's design features of the scheme that yeah, are to be improved or thought about.
Yeah, question in the room.
Do you have like temporary contracts for as long as the project goes and that there's money, and then you have like to reply again, or is it like a long run and you search for money always and you are like for a long run there at this institute?
Yeah, so every research economist, senior research economist, they have permanent contracts from the beginning. Of course, there's a period for review, and then we have to bring in money. Like I said, at some point, once you're an SRE, more senior, you're expected to fund your time, but your salary doesn't depend on that. Your review might be better or worse depending on how you do on that, but you have a permanent contract. We do sometimes have temporary contracts. These are then advertised ad hoc online. Online. There's no kind of systematic temporary contracts. It really depends on demands and projects that are in. But it does happen. And very often people start on temporary and then it was being extended, etc. So they stay longer.
Another question in the room?
What's a typical workday at IFS?
A typical workday, especially. So I think the average workday is probably do quite a lot of work on your desktop. That could be clean data, analyze data, write it out, prepare presentations. So that's key part. Read papers, referee papers, write proposals, kind of think about this. Then we have a lot of seminars going on, so you're expected to attend these seminars, and so you hear about other people's research. You're expected to present your work as well, so you at times give presentations. So there used to be a component of travel to conferences. Now a lot of it is online, so conference and seminars. And then depending on the projects, especially our group working on development, but also more like working in the UK, there might be periods where you spend time in the field, especially kind of the junior ones might be there when there's piloting going on, training of interviewers. There is a lot of work just understanding what interventions are that we evaluate. So we want to talk to beneficiaries and implementing agencies. And then there's of course work in trying to get impacts with the work that we do. That's giving presentations both in academia and to policymakers, but that's kind of engaging in different forums. So it's wrong to say there's no typical day, because on average you work more like as an academic you work on, or when you do your dissertation, but there's a lot to it, and it depends a bit on how you want to structure your work. So there is no one way how people work at the IFS and how much they are at the desk or in the field or engaging. Is that a fair answer?
I can see a nod.
Yeah.
I think Derek had a question.
Oh, hello.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Britta, for your time. We are grateful for the presentation. My question is, at IFS, do you have internship opportunities for undergraduate students interested in research?
Do we have what? What was the first bit? Do
you have internship opportunities?
Oh, internship. You can think of these summer studentships as internships. That's what we, yeah.
Oh.
Okay, Rodrigo?
Yes, earlier in the presentation, in one of the slides, it said that one of the results that you found regarding sanitation was that bringing awareness to the benefits of sanitation, I believe, caused lower investment in the sanitation. Could you expand on that? Because I'm not sure I quite understood it, and it's very counterintuitive. So I'd like to.
So you understood it right. It is counterintuitive. So we had several hypotheses. We couldn't pin down one yet. One is that the information, so the one that we think most, so let me first say one. Something that seems to have happened a bit, but that's not necessarily the main driver, is that there was miscommunication between the microfinance institutions, so the loan officers, and the NGO that did the awareness creation, so that one thought the other would do a bit of more of the monitoring or advising, and one the other did, so that there was a bit of confusion and less focus on how the loans are used. I did mention before, and that's still true, that there's not much monitoring, but there's a bit of discussion in the group, and loan officers might ask if you use it. And so one theory was that this kind of was disturbed and that loan officers did that less, and the NGO didn't pick it up. That could have been one of the channels. Another one we're thinking might be at play, and we kind of hope at the moment enough to show that in the data, is that because of these information activities, people took the loans earlier, and that we see that actually in the data. but then they face constraints in actually constructing toilets. That might be supply constraints, information constraints. It might be that that was just a period where, I don't know, they then used money for harvesting or other reasons, but there was something about the timing that didn't work. And that can actually also link to the subsidy program that just started and was pushed out by the government. People thinking they get the subsidy, taking also the loan, and then realizing it's not that easy and straightforward, and so they didn't use the loan. So these are some of the channels that we are thinking about. But it could also be linking to one of the points that I've said before, that the more groups understand the loan type, that they might have discouraged, had they received more information, that discouraged more the use of loans for sanitation rather than other purposes. So these are the kind of theories that we have at the moment that might be behind that finding, puzzling finding.
So basically miscommunication, timing, and possible discouragement of it by the information are basically the three possible possibilities. Okay, thank you.
If you have thoughts about this, very welcome to hear this.
I'll think about this too, because it's very counterintuitive.
Yeah, hopefully next week we'll get some interesting information also from the field, but it's very hard because of the pandemic, the qualitative work was delayed, and so now it's really a lot of time has passed, so we don't know how much useful information we'll get now. We'll see.
Speaking of passing time, unfortunately, we're out of it now. So Britta, we'd like to thank you so much for making time for us. That was extremely enlightening, even for me, who's read many of your papers. So thank you so much for joining us, and a big round of applause from the students here in Stockholm and the online students.
Thanks for having me. It was really enjoyable. It's always nice to think back of the
Great. Thank you so much for
joining.
joining.
Good luck, everybody, with the course and any exams coming. And
thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great. So just 2 housekeeping items as we finish. So the Stata Lab will happen next Tuesday from 3 to 5 p.m. on Zoom. I'll send the link the day before. This is both for Stockholm students and for RSE students. And there'll be another one the week after that hopefully they'll tell you about in the actual session. And I'll send out an email sometime soon about finding project partners. Some of you have asked me about that. There's a little bit about it in the syllabus, but I'll maybe put some color on that. Next week in lecture, we'll talk about agriculture and risk, a super important topic for low-income countries. That's next Thursday in the same room, again at this bright and early hour. And for those of you who are remote on Zoom. So see you then. Bye-bye. Bye, remote students. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Goodbye, take care.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, take care, sir.
Bye, Navid.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.